Good evening and welcome to the book launch. I am now here in the role, first in the role of research fellow at this wonderful institution, Blinken Open Society Archives at Central European University. I would like to welcome you all. Thank you for coming. I would like to start by thanking all my colleagues who made this wonderful event possible. And some of them are here. Thank you very much to Nora Bertalan, to Arpad Gergets, to Julci, who probably already left, to Julci, led by Juliana, to Zsuzsa Debre, who will help us preserve these wonderful memories of the evening, to Katalin Gádoros, to Kristina Szabados from the Visual Studies platform, and to those who are not here yet, but who helped to put everything together, prepare this important event that we were waiting for or preparing, working towards for quite a few years. My name is Oksana Sarkisova. I'm one of the co-authors of the book that we are going to discuss today, but not here in the role of the moderator, so I'm just saying welcoming words, and I'm very happy that we have Róza Szilágyi with us from Eidolon Center, and this is a co-hosted event by Blinken OSA, Visual Studies Platform, and Eidolon, a fantastic place that just in time was launched in Budapest as Center for Domestic Photography. And with this, I would like to thank you all for being here and pass on the word to Róza.
I think I will use this one. It's really nice to see that we have a beautiful turnout. Thank you very much for all to come here this evening, and I thank the opportunity to Oksana and Olga. Thank you for this invitation. I prepared a short introduction for the book because if I guess it well, some of you might have read it already, and you are the lucky ones, but some of you just know what the book is about. So I think it's important to start a conversation with being on the same page. Invisible Presence explores photographic images' singular power to capture a fleeting moment by approaching them as points of possibility. I do believe that every ordinary photograph has the power to act as a starting point for discussions regarding the social, political, visual, and emotional context of the world we live in. So it is a joy and pleasure to sit here today talking to the two brilliant researchers behind this book. Allow me to introduce them because a lot of you are kind of well known in this scene of photography and researches, but Oksana Sarkisova, she's a research fellow at the Vera and Donald Blinken Open Society Archives and a co-founder of the Visual Studies platform at CU. And Olga Shevchenko is a professor in social studies at the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at Williams College. These are quite short introductions, really focusing on the main event of what you're doing. Some more information in Invisible Presence. The book is a vivid outline of the role that family archives play in the almost constantly changing zeitgeist. It does all this in such a manner that we can structurally understand the individual ways that inspired, catalyzed, and influenced the ways of everyday photography practices during the Soviet era. The book draws on a decade of fieldworks and interviews, as well as internet ethnography, media analysis, and case studies. With more than 250 black and white photos that you can see just right behind us, Invisible Presence is an astonishing journey into domestic photography, family memory, and the ongoing debate over the meaning of the Soviet past that is timely and powerful today as it has ever been. I would like to point it out that, and I must add that the writing style of the book is super outstanding to me, and I really enjoyed it and find it super sophisticated, but at the same time perfectly enjoyable, even with all the difficult conclusions it communicates regarding a particular past era. So I advise every one of you to read it and take your time with it because it's such a good read. Moving on to the questions. Could you please tell me what was your main inspiration behind focusing on family photography and focusing on the particular region the book deals with?
Thank you so much, Róza, for these introductions and for the question. Before I dive into this, I just want to thank everyone here for coming, for your interest in vernacular photography, and for looking closely. And to also express my thanks to the Open Society Institute and to Central European University. For me, it's sort of a homecoming, among other things, because I'm a CEU alumna and also did a lot of the brainstorming with Oksana on this book when I was a junior fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies. So it's very, very special to be here. To answer your question, it's a really good one. I think the more I think about it, the more answers I'll have, but I'll just offer the first one that popped in my mind. I think a lot of projects kind of start from an itch or a sense of dissatisfaction, actually, less than an inspiration. So I think that in our case, I think it started from a desire to put together living memory with vernacular images and photographs, in a sense that these are the topics that are very richly explored by almost unrelated fields. We wanted to look at them in a kind of a relationship triangulation with one another to see how photographs live, not just how they look, not just how they look to us, but how they live and what they do to people that actually own them, and how they actually play out very differently in the hands of different generations, for example, within the same family. So this sort of push to make, in some ways, images speak was something that was, I think, a driving force for us from the get-go. And I'm sure Oksana will have things to add.
Yes, these were, of course, the questions that were inspiring and motivating, but there was also a prehistory to the starting of this project, even though the story is long enough in itself. I mean, we really started the pilot work in 2005, but before that, we actually ran a project together that was titled Thinking Figuratively, and that was our attempt to really dive head-on into the interdisciplinarity. For that project, we have invited scholars from across the fields in humanities and social sciences to talk about visual materials. That was the moment, early 2000s, when the visual studies was really a booming field, especially coming to Russia, and the questions on post-Soviet condition were very much urgent at the time, and being unsettled and revisited. And what we did at that point is that we organized a series of seminars. For each of them, we have invited 2 people from very different fields to talk about the same material. I have to say that it was a very good learning curve and a very interesting experience, seeing that sometimes people can talk to each other from different fields and with different backgrounds, and sometimes it actually is a very, very challenging exercise and maybe a bit of a forced setting that we have came up with. But coming out of that experience, we thought that maybe we should try to do something like this ourselves, but not on such a short one seminar framework, but on a somewhat more in-depth way. And this in-depth way turned out to be 17 years. So that's another extreme that we dived in. But this idea of thinking about images both as visuals, but also as historical artifacts, and also about the whole social environment the images are embedded with, was in some way inspired by that project.
And may I ask, did you have any examples before you started your research? Like, what kind of project would you like to lead? During that time, you mentioned that you had your own project, but were there others who kind of focused or started to focus on the same topic as you were interested in? I'm just curious because right now we just exchanged some words on it. There is a zeitgeist to the interest in vernacular imagery, ordinary imagery, the banal imaging. But back then, because it's such a long project, the situation was a tiny bit different. So if you could elaborate the situation during those times when you've started your research, I'm quite curious, what was the situation back then?
So I think actually there was a sort of the first kind of whiffs of interest in the visual art in the early 2000s. So our workshop wasn't the only workshop that was sort of taking on these questions at the time. And I actually very acutely remember writing a funding proposal for what later on became our field work, and doing research online and discovering that, you know, as I'm sitting in my small town, Williamstown, in Massachusetts, there's this extremely exciting summer school on visual studies happening in Moscow that united actually a lot of the people that we later came to meet and become friends and colleagues with. Where various authors, like theorists, like first row kind of theorists on visual things, like Michael N. Hawley. I think Tom Mitchell was doing this as well. We're coming to Russia at the time, and created quite, I think, a sort of a sense of intellectual excitement. And I remember thinking, oh, we missed everything. You know, so we didn't know enough, I think, at the time of what was going on in those seminars to really treat them as a model. But it does show, I think, that, you know, even if you think you're having a great idea, it's probably also somewhere in the air and someone else is thinking along those lines. So part of the joy is sort of finding those people, as we did later on.
Yes, absolutely. There were also very interesting summer schools organized at CEU by Margareta Dikovitskaya on the visual studies, on the methodologies, and exactly the interdisciplinary nature of visual studies. There was an anthology by Nicholas Mirzoev coming out at about the same time. So there was really a lot already being done, and of course much earlier. I mean, in a way, that field, especially in English language literature, was really actively published, you know, decades before. But maybe coming into that field for us a lot felt like a novelty at that time. But indeed, because we were both doing our preliminary research in Russia, the publications there were just coming out. The series of volumes on visual anthropology, for example, was published in the early 2000s, and that included a lot of colleagues who were also part of Thinking Figuratively workshop.
The motto for the book is a citation from John Berger, and I find it beautiful, and I really like this citation that says, all photographs are a form of transport and an expression of absence. And this sentence, besides being a perfect summary of our emotional connection to ordinary photographs, sums up kind of the final structure of the book too, as I see it, because you state it, and if you will read it, you will see that the first half is about how photographic practices punctuate people's lives, and the second part, like summing it up, is it sums up how silence works in connection with domestic photographs. And could you please elaborate on the process behind creating the final narrative of the published material? Because I think you must have had a really interesting intertwined fabric from the long years of interviews, and I'm quite curious how the final narrative, the final form of your research took place.
Yes, it's really hard to say that. I mean, now that it is a material object and a visible presence, this book, it has a final form, but we still feel that it's a, you know, the interpretations are in flux, and you know, as we speak, of course, the context is incredibly different right now with the full-scale invasion. Again, the meaning of the Soviet past and the meaning of these images is yet again being rethought very, very dramatically. So it's never completely final, but of course we had to stop at some point. And our original idea was to keep that protean, that mosaic structure and nature to the book and to the writing. So actually our original concept with which we lived for quite a few years as a tentative title was Snapshot Histories. So our writing wanted to preserve something of that snapshot nature in it, which actually eludes the finality, eludes the, firmly built architectonics of, a building that's completed once and for all. And that's where we are trying to return to that issue of reinterpretation and the space for untangling this kind of straightforward indexical understanding of photography over and over again in the chapters, sometimes on a micro level, sometimes on a more kind of general way of seeing how photographs change their meaning in the context, sometimes in the private context, in private communication, sometimes in public space.
I would maybe also add that just to sort of add on to your characterization, which I think is very precise, kind of tack on a third part, because of course we have Berger's epigraph, but we also have one from Hans Belting, art historian who recently and unfortunately passed away, left a lot of amazing writing. And there he kind of implicitly, I think, converses with Berger, who ends up on absence, where he says images are an expression of absence. And Belting points out that the images actually replace absence with what he calls a different kind of presence. And we found that really interesting to think about this idea of a different kind of presence, right? They're not anymore the bodies or the moments or the experiences. They're something else, and they enable other kinds of ways of relating to the past. They enable ways of expressing ambivalence by manipulating with these images. They enable endless reinterpretations that Oksana spoke about. So in the end, I think they create a sort of a foundation for something different, something else. Now they circulate as images in the world, and they tell different kinds of histories to different kinds of eyes. So there is this kind of, presence, absence, silence, and then another kind of presence that comes, in their life as images, not anymore as experiences or memories.
Yes, and it's, I think we all have the experience of having family archives and flipping through them, and you might remember the photographs themselves, but there is the act of remembering with the help of the photographs. And you also talk about this idea in the book, and I really like that small chapter. So this kind of sums up the humane way of talking and thinking about this imagery practice to me. There is one question I have to ask, because I'm quite curious. You did achieve a huge thing, and it was a long time. You were doing it for a lot of years. Could you please tell us your process? Because you did a lot of interviews, you met a lot of people, you've seen tons of images, but at some point you had to have a process in mind. So please tell me how you did this, because it's super inspiring and I'm really curious.
We might not recommend keeping a project for 17 years necessarily, but the process was not, the time is of course linear in some way, but this process was not really linear and was not really this kind of constantly ongoing. It had detours, it had sometimes totally different dimensions. We started with even more ambitious project that we have managed to complete. We really wanted to travel across the post-Soviet spaces, newly independent countries, not so newly, but independent countries that have very different memories of the Soviet times. We, of course, were at that moment of imagining the project were much less mindful of the resources and especially the time as a resource, but there were many other things that happened in between. We were both doing other things in public and in private. But our most cherished memories are the joint fieldwork research, and that's something that, you know, the experience of that and the conversations we had then were really keeping this project going ahead. It first had small steps as articles where we really tackled just one at a time, either a locality or a family or a particular aspect of vernacular photography. It's a universe. I mean, you can't possibly cover everything there is there to say. So it was an idea to communicate in that book exactly that openness of the field, openness of the material, and to give some of the ways of thinking about it, but certainly not exhaust them.
So I think I have maybe not great recommendations. Things that worked for us don't necessarily work for everyone else. So I want to say a few words in support of emotions that are usually not considered very productive. Guilt, I think, is very effective, and panic is also very effective. In our case, I think because the research was supported by many institutions, there was also a sense that even in the moments when we felt like we're, you know, struggling to find time to write together or losing a sense of direction, just a sense of how many, you know, people, starting from our own family members, but also colleagues, institutions that supported the fieldwork on this project, how many people and structures invested into it, I think kept us going in moments when we felt like we wouldn't. And I think the you know, external deadlines also helped to propel it along, because certainly working from 2 different time zones, in Oksana's case having a full-time job outside of writing, in my case teaching also full-time, sometimes finding the time was the biggest challenge. And so taking it piece by piece, as Oksana said, writing conference papers instead of thinking about it as chapters was one thing that we could, you know, do in this more peripatetic schedule. And then coming back to it once we've accumulated enough of a sort of critical mass, and then divvying up the work that is left between the 2 of us to kind of take the lead on writing specific chapters, and then swapping and editing and expanding on those chapters was something that helped as well. In my case, I think teaching helped in the sense that a very similar process in teaching, I find that you sort of oftentimes feel that it's impossible to do justice to a discipline. For example, I teach social theory very often, and it's 13 weeks, and you have, you know, classical and contemporary, and in my case, sociological and anthropological theory. So at some point, you just have to forgive yourself for not creating a detailed enough map, and decide that you will just pursue threads. And if you choose the threads well enough, it will be not exhaustive, but it will be better than nothing. And I think that's how emotionally sort of we gave ourselves, I think, permission to just say, okay, we have over 10,000 images in our collection, and when we were writing, we didn't even think that we would be able to feature 200 of them, you know, leave alone anything more than that. And just to give ourselves the permission to just use these selective images as sort of narrative threads to tie together, as opposed to feeling like we have to present, you know, the map, the size of a territory to our readers, I think was a very useful, useful permission to give ourselves.
I do salute you for keeping your focus for such a long time, and ordinary photography is such a huge play field, and you really have to choose your threads wisely to be able to kind of paint a picture that can be read and understood from afar, and I think you managed it beautifully. You elaborately described the fact in the book that you wanted to talk to the actual safekeepers of these family archives, but also found it important to talk to several generations available around the archives or connected to the archives. And it must have been interesting during the process to see how the first-hand knowledge turns into some kind of a guesswork when you talk to younger generations, and you use the phrase the liquid time of photography. So how the liquid time of photography takes its effect. Could you please describe the different reactions and connections the generations had to the same archive? And do you think these attitudes you've met are specific for the region you tackled?
So that was our idea from the very beginning, that we would like to hear different people from the same family to talk about their collections, that sometimes they are responding to the events that are represented from their own lives. Sometimes they're commenting on their elder generations. And we wanted to focus on the short 20th century, on the memory of the Soviet times, because there is also a technological transformation that is in a way almost coinciding with the collapse of the breakdown of the Soviet Union. But we were very much interested in hearing these stories rather than having an exam for the younger generations on the knowledge of their grandparents and parents' experiences. We really wanted to let them comment on the things that they find engaging and interesting. That's why these conversations were sometimes very, very open. I mean, they were always open, but they really took the path that our interlocutors decided to pursue. We spoke separately to different generations, and we didn't fix the age groups, so we just spoke to grandparents, parents, and children, and sometimes the ages were very, very different. Sometimes there were 4 generational families we were fortunate to talk to, and sometimes there were only 2 present. But 3 was our hope and intention and desire. And these conversations were incredibly instructive, because we really could see how not just that the stories transform and certain memories transform, but also how the contemporary moment defines the way the experiences are being interpreted and reinterpreted. Maybe you want to add? I don't want to talk too long.
Yeah, I will say that, I mean, it's interesting. We tried not to sound like examiners. I think oftentimes younger generation did perceive us as sort of testing their knowledge of family histories, which was something that we had to actively work to sort of battle against. And by way of developing empathy, we interviewed each other's parents. Unfortunately, our grandparents weren't around anymore, just as a kind of a sensitizing device, because you realize that it's a process that's in some ways kind of inherent to generational dynamic. And especially when you're talking with people who are so young that they don't really relate to their parents. They're not doing things they remember their parents doing. So everything feels very distant for people who are still in high school. So to sort of prevent ourselves from sounding too kind of schoolmarmish or scolding about it, we sort of wanted to start from a place of humility to realize how little we actually know about our own, in some ways, family histories. And partly it has to do also with the format of the conversation, because I think Alessandro Portelli talked about oral history and described it as, I think, never told stories, twice told tales, or something like this, because nobody conducts an oral history with their own family members. So because we were so purposeful in speaking with the older generation, oftentimes we had a fresher sense of like family genealogy, or a more cohesive sense of family genealogy than their children or grandchildren, because their conversations were much more partial. They were always in the backdrop of talking about something else, and so on. So in some ways, it was kind of a setup for us to enter into the conversations with the younger generation, knowing a little bit more than they did, ironically, about their family. And we really didn't want this to be a kind of a judgment passed on them. We were much more interested in sort of qualitative differences and how they framed the past. So just to give a story that's on the pages of the book, so you know it well, Róza, is looking at a group photograph of children, kindergarten-age children, sort of huddled around the table. we spoke with a grandmother who was a nurse in this kindergarten, and she had very sort of fond and benign memories of that period, and in fact picked out that photograph as sort of indicative of the kind of care and sort of civilizing that happened in these daycare centers at the time, where children were really taught to, personal hygiene. They were taught to be good members of society. And then her granddaughter picked out the exact same photo as indicative of depravity of Soviet life, and pointed out that, look at these poor kids. They're all dressed the same. They all look the same. You can't even tell, who's the boy, who's the girl, what's going on. So it was
maybe the buzz cut did not help, because every child in the picture had a buzz cut, so it translates quite differently to my generation, let's say.
That's very true. It's in that lineup, so at some point it might flash on the screen, and maybe multiple will flash on the screen, because it's not an unusual look or setup. But so for us, it was more interesting to see how kind of meaningful frames that people applied to these photographs were different, as opposed to their kind of factual gaps in knowledge.
But also, if I can just add one thing, we were really interested in speaking to different generations and seeing how they, if we use the memory studies vocabulary here, how communicative memory, the kind of face-to-face interaction, is being kind of merged with and overlapped and gradually giving way to the other forms of memory, to the cultural memory, to the public discourses that are ultimately very strongly shaping, especially the interpretation of the younger generations, for whom this is not a first-hand experience. This is the past of someone else that they are imagining, and they're imagining it increasingly with the help of the popular culture, with the help of films and other visual aids that circulate around them.
History lessons,
all sorts of other ways of interacting with history in public space. And in that sense, it was, I don't think it would be very different elsewhere, just to go back to your question, but I think it would be even more different now if this conversation would happen now, when there is a much more direct interference into shaping how Soviet past is to be interpreted in public sphere.
While reading the book, the reader can sometimes feel like being in the same room with you during the interviews, and I really like that at some points of your storytelling, there are small moments that help us imagine how the whole situation might have happened. And I do remember one part when you elaborate on these generational ideas and the fact that you want to talk to as many generations as you can, but in some cases you were not able to do these interviews individually because they live in a small flat, and you start one interview and the other person hears what the other one says, and they kind of come into the interview, and this whole situation, how people react to photography and the shared memories, you can really sense it through the words of the book. So it's super enjoyable. But I'm quite curious, how did you manage to ask people to open up their family archives and tell you the stories that they might not tell to anyone else, or talk about the absences in their family archive, talk about those parts of family history that we try to forget, not emphasize? Because the book tells a lot of stories that, if it was me, I wouldn't want to tell.
Depends who you're talking to. But thank you. That's probably the best compliment one can give, that you could kind of have this sense of co-presence, and I'm very glad if that transpired to you this way. We were, in that sense, probably very, I don't know if we should praise ourselves, but it was really a big
Please
advantage to not just audio tape the interview, so not just record the sound, but actually to do a video. And that was how we agreed with the families, that we would come and we would video record with a very primitive, especially by today's standard, very primitive amateur video camera, still working on the mini DV tapes that we had also years to convert and to kind of catch up with the digital turn that overtook us completely. But part of the reason why we could reconstruct that atmosphere, which would have not been possible, years later, remember all these tiny details, is because we could go back to the video recordings and we could really not just hear what people say, but also see how they interact with the images, how the space is being arranged, how they, how they store these images, where they're kept, where they take them out from. And at that point, I can say that we didn't have to do too much convincing. Only on occasions. There were a few cases where, this kind of reflexes of concern were activated even before we started asking any questions. And there were 1 or 2 interviews that were kind of stopped before even being started. But overall, people were really eager to talk about their family stories. They were very happy that someone came and asked. The other side of the coin, and that we also try to communicate this in the book, is that people have ideas of how to present their biographies, of how to talk to people as historical subjects, of what is worth to communicate, especially to strangers who appear with all this equipment and you kind of feel yourself as a subject that enters the big history book. So there were a lot of narratives that were kind of official narratives that we tried to somehow listen to, but then go beyond that. By asking questions that are not creating subjects from the history textbooks.
And I also think we had allies, so you mentioned Zeitgeist. And I think at the time when we were doing the interviews, mostly 2006, 2008, and we had a sort of a later foray in the field as well, but in both of those periods, there was a sort of a sense of that history was something uplifting. I think it was very early in the Putin's presidency where history began to get sort of instrumentalized as a sort of affirmative pride. But the way it translated at the time was that it's a good thing to be interested in your family stories and family genealogy. Usually the assumption was that it's a source of pride or something, as I said, uplifting. But in that sense, in a way, we were kind of interpolated in the context of the zeitgeist as asking, proper questions about the family past that people were also invited to, ask by public institutions or in schools and so on. So it was sort of easy to peg us. Of course, the way photographs work is they unearth a lot of stories that are not at all uplifting. And that's something that kind of sweeps one away when you're looking at the family album. That's one of the most amazing things about vernacular photographs and how they work as memory objects. So once people were sort of engaged in memory work, it brought up a lot of sort of deeper, less over-determined stories and memories about their past, which sometimes surprised them. So that's one thing. And the other thing I wanted to say is there's a kind of an inverse effect. So typically, you're invited to look at a family album when you become it's sort of like a rite of passage and of becoming part of a family, right? Like you're seeing someone for a long time, and then at some point the parents flip out the family album, sort of invite you in the family past in a way. So I think we experienced the reverse of it. I mean, we came in complete strangers to families that we didn't know at all. But because we were sitting and looking at the family albums, it's almost as if the kind of the dramaturgy of that moment made us almost kind of quasi-family members. So I think we were received actually in a much more welcoming way than, typically a stranger doing a 3-hour interview would be received, by virtue of that sort of the magic of the photographs as well in some way.
Yes, and safekeeping a family archive is a really important task. Like, kind of the leader of the family safekeeps the archives and these archives, and when you pass the family archive to your daughter or son, is like kind of passing the baton And you also write about this, how several ladies stated that they are kind of interested in their archives, but they will have enough time to delve into them. And at some point in their life, an unknown later moment, they will be the safekeeper of these family photo books, family archives, and at that point, they will deal with them. But until then, they are just happy to have them, but they don't care as much about them. And these connections, these dynamics in a family is also super interesting to read about. So I enjoyed that part too. As you also state, and I think we also know and feel this, that family archives are kind of part of a huge memorial landscape. Hence, your interviews, the interviews you conducted, I think, like spread it like a maze. They were really intertwined. You also mentioned this during this small interview we are doing, and depending on the emotional status of your partner, the person you are talking to, you also mentioned this just right before, and depending on the photograph you have in hand and so on. What was your approach when you finished the interviews and turned your gaze towards the actual writing part of the process? How could you create an order in everything you just heard and experienced? Because I do think the emotional part of doing these interviews has an effect on you, because as you've just mentioned, you kind of become part of a family for a short time, and then you leave them. You kind of never meet them again, and you have this huge task ahead of you to summarize what you just heard from a lot of people. And I'm quite curious, what kind of methods did you have? Because you said you tackled smaller parts, but what else?
Yeah, it's true. I just want to affirm what you said in terms of, I think any interviewing relationship is funny in that way, because, you know, for the person you're interviewing, you're just 2 hours of their day. For you, they stay with you for as long as you're on this project. So there is this sort of weird kind of intimacy or weird commitment to people that we felt full well when we were actually getting back to some of them to negotiate the permission to publish their images, calling them and sort of trying to remind them of who we are, you know, 15 years after we visited. And oftentimes, I mean, most of them could remember it, which I think is impressive. But I don't think they realize just how much we've been thinking about them all of these years. It was almost absurd. But that's just a side note. In terms of the process, insofar as there was a process, the sociological sort of way of dealing with interviews would be through coding. And that's what we spent actually the entire year at the Institute of Advanced Studies. That's what we're doing. We would rewatch the interviews, first review the photographs, quickly scan the transcripts, because all the interviews were transcribed, but then really rewatch the interviews and basically create sort of salient categories so that we have a way to sort of cross-reference and find themes across interviews. So we ended up with a kind of a sprawling document of 30+ pages, which had key categories, subcategories, and then specific sort of key moments in the interviews and the page numbers on the transcripts that this sends back to. So that was sort of the way that we tried to wrestle all of this into some sort of order. It also became increasingly obvious as we went along that we also had to really not only sort of code and thematize the substance, but also come up with some categories for the actual interaction that people have with their photographs, like physical interaction, ways of holding them, kind of work that photographs are asked to do in the course of interviews, where at some moment they become a substitute for the person, at another moment they become a prop, in another moment they become like a time machine device. So these sorts of meta categories were also very important, and that's something that it took us a while to recognize, that we should also keep an eye for that and not just for the stories that people were telling.
Yeah, I would just say I think we never managed to fully quantify our images or fully code them, and just as photographs have this multiplicity of meanings that they change as time goes on, so was in a way our system of relating to both what we've heard and what we saw and what we continue to return to. Our immediate response after the interview was to record our own commentary, just kind of freshly off, so that we would keep the memories of how we felt and what we found most intriguing in the conversations, in the dynamic, in the spaces we visited. So we had these first notes, and we actually did the audio recording just for the speed of it, and I'm very, very happy we did it, because revisiting them again 10 years later, there's such a wealth of detail that is just gone and is not even on the video, because it's about, how you enter, how you say first words, what you actually kind of conclude when leaving. So that was very, very important. But also our categories changed, and our sense of importance changed, and the whole public dynamic changed. So we actually framed the book with the discussion of memory politics in Russia at the beginning of at the start of our research, and also then at the final stage of our interviewing, which concerns the Immortal Regiment and these interviews that Olga were doing in 2018-19 primarily. So we felt that we have to at some point bring more strongly that public context, even though we originally started with the idea of focusing on vernacular photography in the first place. But the context was changing, and thus our categories had to change as well.
There are a lot of brilliant ideas in the books, but there is one tiny detail that I really like, is the fact that some of the images are not just digitized pictures of the photographs, but we have kind of screenshots from videos where you can see people holding their own photographs. And I find it important because it's 400-something pages, I don't remember, but you read, and you just see these digitized images, and you forget about the people behind them. And this act of showing their hand I find it beautiful. And it might be because you lacked a digitized image, or it might be because you're just brilliant, but it works really well. So I just wanted to point it out, that I find it a really nice gesture. And I know I'm asking you to summarize your book, but I really would like to ask this question. What do you think, what makes these family photo collections from the post-Soviet region differ from their counterparts elsewhere in the world? Because actually, in a way, the whole book pinpoints these connections between these photographs and the world, and this region and the world, and there is the underlying differences between what happened at other parts of the world and how people kind of related to their family photographs. So what's special about these photographs?
Should I start? Yeah. So I think one way to think about it would be just to think about technological context, right? So to the extent that this photography was a kind of do-it-yourself activity from beginning to an end, it translates into very different kinds of currents of circulation of photographs, different contexts in which images could or could not be taken, different patterns of dissemination where it cost nothing at all to print an extra couple of copies. So an amateur photographer in their own bathroom would print, 6 different copies and give it to everyone in the photograph. So there are these kind of patterns of similarity across different families and different albums because of how photographs were produced. So that's, I guess, one. And of course, there's the look. And it's very unfinished look because a lot of them were done by people for whom it mattered who the photograph depicts, but not the how and the sort of the technical polish of it. Then there's, I think, the visibly different extent of interpenetration of the public and the private, where the public identities, public commitments, public memberships have a much greater presence in the family album than in the albums that sometimes I see in like American collections or even in American homes. That wall between the public and private is not there, and partly it's because some of the photos are in the family album because they were brought by some currents from the outside world, Again, there was a photo shoot at work, and everyone who was part of the photo shoot got a copy. And so as a result, you have a family album that really features something that's much bigger than the family, or in much more metaphorical sense, is a family. So that's a difference as well. Another one I would highlight perhaps is the degree to which photographs were both a form of sort of incorporation, participation in the Soviet project. That was very, it was part and parcel of what it was like to be a proper Soviet person, was to photograph in a particular way, to see in a particular way. So it was a way to kind of manifest loyalty. But they also, because they trace family connections, always have something that's compromising about them in the end. So and that means also that they carry, traces of destruction. If there was a family member that lived or didn't live through state terror who was destroyed by it, and then their likenesses were destroyed as well, and so that leaves traces. And so as a result, the album preserves both the sort of the unspeakable parts, the traumas of the period, and these very deliberate efforts to overcome them, to be Soviet, to perform the kind of the Soviet way of looking, or the Soviet forms of sociability that are necessary to kind of cast off that stigma. So that's another thing that I think is very different. But in the end, I think what makes them really powerful too is, in some ways, and you're looking at them as we speak, they're actually not that different. And so they create this immediate bond between, the onlooker and the image itself that makes them so relatable and so emotionally moving. I think it's the fact that they kind of speak the same language as our own albums, wherever we are.
Yeah, that's actually what I wanted to highlight, is that indeed I would be very curious to hear your comments on what you see. You see here a selection of images that is mainly in the book, but also more than in the book, but also not all the images that are in the book are in the slideshow, but we try to make a selection to give a bit of a visual flavor of the material that we were working with. But I think it's very important to highlight, and it's very good that we also mentioned the things that are invisible, the things that are not, that are traces, very sometimes deep emotional traces in the narratives, but they're not visible in the images themselves, yet they're there. But also I think what is very specific maybe to the moment, I'm not saying that it's necessarily specific to the material itself, but the images of the reconstructed fantasies of the past that these images are currently enabling is what I think something that sets them apart of the other innocent and banal images of happy family holidays elsewhere.
There is one particular image that we even chose to illustrate the interview I did with you for a journal, where you see a lady with a newly born baby and her husband, and you see 2 or 3 figures standing next to them. And looking at this image today, you would think, of course, the family visited the newly born baby when they were leaving the hospital, but actually it's the colleagues who visited the lady, because this belonging was the connections in the society, and what you have to photograph and what you have to enforce was a tiny bit different than today. So these small extra informations give you a sense of what you just told, that the context was quite different, and what people photographed, in a sense, was a tiny bit different than what we would photograph today. As I think we are reaching the end of an hour discussion, I do have 2 more questions, but before I ask them, I would like to ask the audience if anyone has any questions relating the book because the authors are here and they told me that they are quite happy to answer your questions. So if there's anyone who has, yes, oh, that's so nice to see. How should we do this? Because
I think we have an extra mic.
I'm so sorry for hijacking the event, but I think it's important to.
Hi, does it work? Just a second. Right, so my name is Maria Kovanskaya, and yeah, I'm actually from that background. And my question is about black and white photos. Basically, at least in this presentation, we can see black and white photos and very few colored photos. Was it your deliberate choice, or just people prefer to show you the photos from 60s and 70s? Because in 80s, in the Soviet Union, we had more color photos than black and white photos.
Yes, thank you for the question. It roughly represents, I mean, maybe not mathematically, but roughly represents the proportions of the color to black and white that we have in the overall database, which is like more than 10,000 images. But part of it is simply technological complexity of color images. Most of the images we have seen were done by the amateur photographers, many of them at home, and the practice was 99% of these amateur images developed, printed in the bathrooms or other makeshift labs were black and white images. The color images came from the studios or from hired photographers or from the travels where there was someone on the spot with a more professional equipment, and these were the color images. But when we speak about vernacular photography where there is an amateur photographer behind it, then the vast majority would be black and white, and that reflects in the archives. Of course, the collections that we have seen had a lot of color images, but that was really the Kodak time breaking through in the very early 90s, when the whole culture of photography changes, when the easy-to-use equipment, the point-and-shoot cameras are entering, when this network of studios where you can bring the roll of film and have it processed. So then we go back to the you push the button, we do the rest logic of Kodak that really revolutionized the amateur photography in the, let's say, Western world already in the early 20th century, and something that comes only in the 1990s in such a wide scale in the places where we have conducted interviews. But since we were interested very much about the memories of the Soviet times, we were looking at the photographs from that period, so kind of cutting off in the 90s, more or less, when really the color breaks through.
My second question is about other photos from the earlier stages of the Soviet state, and I'm meaning the era before 1953, before the death of Stalin. So do people still have photos from that time? Because unfortunately in my family none of the photos before 1960s have been saved, partly because of the war, partly because of some people who were persecuted in our family.
Yes. Want to take that, or shall I?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the same way as Oksana pointed out, they're sort of proportionately a minority, and most of them come from studio portraits, because portable cameras, that's the story of post-war camera production, as well as production of photographic equipment for development and so on. So there are some pre-revolutionary photographs as well, scattered here and there. Definitely very few. We only saw one or two albums, pre-revolutionary albums, sort of that are sort of composed entities. But otherwise, it's just a smattering. And as I mentioned, most of them are from a studio photographer. We've seen traces of one or two amateur photographer from the 1920s, so snapshot type of images, but it's definitely definitely very rare. And something that this then lends itself to, actually, is not only is the photo album as a genre kind of loosely isomorphic to the Soviet period, but also the colors become metaphors. So people talk about black and white as the color of socialism in some ways, because much of it is depicted in black and white.
Does anybody else has a...
Thank you very much for these pictures. I have two very different questions. I will start with one of them and we'll see if we're willing to answer another one. I was just watching these pictures and I'm also from the similar background, let's say. So it's pictures of, I can recognize some images which were happening in my own kindergarten or could happen there. Or some pictures I kind of match with the images that my grandmom or my parents have in their family albums. Same kind of social background and the objects which are there. I was just wondering, I mean, probably this is also your background, and you were mentioning that you were thinking of working with different backgrounds of the ex-Soviet countries, which were not your countries, but you finally choose to or focused on your own background. So let's say it this way. How do you refer emotionally? Did it help for you? How you were working emotionally with these recognitions of the traces and objects? Yeah, I'm just watching this and it touches me a lot of pictures, and I was thinking, how is it with you?
Thank you. I still feel it's a big limitation of the book that we only focused on the memories of the Soviet past in, not just in Russia, but even in a very limited part of Russia. And of course, the time frame is also very limited in a way, even though it feels long for an individual life and a single project. But I think the limitation that I feel is that the stories that we, of course, understand are very, still, even with the variety of them, they're still very selected and very limited in what we could possibly cover in one book. I feel that this whole polyphony of ways of remembering the Soviet period would have been very different if we could step out of that experience that maybe was to some extent familiar to us. But in some way, it's not, as I tried to say in the beginning, it's not something of a complete coverage of what vernacular photography does. Even in that context, it's more of a trigger to think about how it works in other contexts. So for me, in a way, the challenge was less the emotional load of these images. We had to, of course, process a lot of nostalgic narratives that these images trigger. I think we have, maybe because of our family histories, less of that burden. But the challenge was to write and see the unspoken and the invisible and still present. I don't know if that answers, but maybe you can add.
I think also when we look at this stream of images, I think we're in a slightly different situation than you, in the sense that I immediately begin thinking, whose, right? Like, I'm sent back to the family that they come from and their specific story and what the living room looked like, the wallpaper. It makes them less likely to be what they actually are in the public sphere, which is they're becoming these kinds of generic metaphors for the Soviet past in a way. And so they will have the emotional effect that in some ways you sort of associate with that period, depending on your politics, your family experience, and so on, that can really vary. So it has this kind of like metaphorical work that is less working its magic on us, because for us they're very specific people with very specific sort of lives and quirks. And so in that way, it's a kind of, I don't know if it's a defense, because some of those lives are actually more poignant if you know the details, but it's poignant in a different way. It's more kind of rooted in the specifics of their experience.
Thank you.
You said you had 2 questions. There's another question right there, but I think it's your choice, but we can take our time.
We should take one more.
Hi, thank you, and really thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed it. Well, actually, I have 3 questions, but I will stop on 2 for others to be able to speak a bit. So I am mostly curious about the idea of a safekeeper of a family album. And was that an idea that kind of pop out in your interviews, especially with the second and the third generation? So this is my first question. And the second one was, during your research, have you found only family albums as a way of representation of family pictures, or were families representing their pictures in some other way, like for instance in the box, or something else? And okay, maybe the third question, if I can, could you maybe talk a bit more about the relationship between auto-ethnography, because you talked about that you interviewed your own families first, and your interviews with other people, and how did you negotiate those 2 in your writing? Thank you.
Maybe for timing reason, we should take a question each. What do you think, Oksana? How about I'll take the second, because the one about the one about the other forms of representing, or if I understood correctly, kind of using family archives in other forms other than albums. There are many different ways, but one that seems to be very popular and analytically very interesting is several times we saw these large collages, family collages, and typically they're produced for a date, for an anniversary, for a family member, that are these fascinating documents where images are, it all starts from the family album, but images are digitized and then pasted around to create some form of kind of representation of transtemporal community. And in very interesting ways, it actually mirrors the pre-album tradition that is mostly rural, of creating these big photo frames with multiple photographs in the same frame that people we spoke to associated very strongly with rural practices. So oftentimes these get disassembled when the family moves into the city. So that kind of scattered in the 1960s. So it's fascinating to see then them coming back together in this like digitized way as these representations of generational, ostensibly kind of graphic family trees, which are not horizontal anymore, because village frames were mostly, you could have parents, but mostly you would have, 2 or 3 generations, but a lot of like distant relatives and friends all crammed into the same frame. And now they're much more like a root going deep. So it's an effort to kind of root oneself in history rather than spreading wide to kind of wider communities. It's more kind of an effort to find a kind of an anchoring in this idea of a lineage. So same but different.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, that was the practices of display, but the practices of storage, of course, the album is just actually a minor form of storing the family photographs. So we did, and knowing your research also, we did find a lot of shoeboxes, plastic bags, all sorts of other carriers where the family photographs were stored. Not always. I mean, they can also, and we try to speak about the mobility of the family photographs, them changing the status at different kind of liminal points when they go, sometimes on display, and sometimes it's connected to a big change in family, very often with a loss in the family. But it was very interesting for us to see how this, how the photographs are having this kind of latent ability that sometimes gets realized at a particular juncture in time, but maybe not. So it also keeps this polyvalency or this multiplicity, this potentiality each image has. But yes, in terms of storing photographs, we actually start our chapter with an example of 2 albums that our elderly interlocutor presented to us, and both of them were retirement projects. So what we encountered as a family photograph was only put together after he retired, and he kind of looked retrospectively at his life and came up with a very non-chronological but a lineage of symbolic importance of the both images and also the personalities that these images represent. In terms of autoethnography, it was at first our kind of, part of a pilot stage that we would, kind of think about how to go about it, but it actually turned out to be a very instructive process in so many ways. We had very similar encounters. We've heard the stories of each other's parents that were told to an interviewer rather than to a family member. We also learned new things when we started asking more systematically, and in that sense it resonated with the experiences of younger generations that commented on, you never told me this story before, that we've heard. And what was the first question? Please remind me.
Rite of passage and the idea of a safekeeper of a family album.
Yes, and that's a very important one indeed, because it's a very gendered practice. Like, that was obvious. We really kind of try to strive at a gender balance and try to talk to men and women in a fairly balanced proportion, but women are much more the safeguardians, the keepers of the collections, the transmitters of them, and they sometimes assign these roles to their children accordingly, and also have certain expectations. So in that sense, I also don't think it's specific to the families we've spoken to.
Thank you.
I do have one last question to summarize our evening with, and it's a more personal one, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but you are already kind of there. So we often play favorites with artworks, literature, movies, and so on. And I know that, and we can sense that your research is starting with the photographs, but also working with the stories and contexts and oral history around them. But do you have a favorite photograph from the book? And if you do, then why? And I ask this because hopefully a lot of you will take home a book tonight, and then you will have a short story just for you, and you will be able to look for these photographs that you guys will share with us. So please tell me, what's your favorite photograph from the book and why?
I'm not sure if it's about a favorite photograph, but the photograph that is certainly very poignant once you have the whole conversation behind it. And we have that story in the book as well, and that's the story that opens the chapter on silence for me. And that's a portrait, a beautiful young woman, very relaxed, smiling, but calm. And that's the picture from 1952 when she was a student in Leningrad studying languages. actually Russian language, to become a Russian language teacher. And she showed it. It actually came up. Her collection was exactly one of this kept in a plastic bag, and it was in no particular order. But this photo and several other from the same time, her student years, came up fairly early in our conversation. She commented on the time when she was a student, and how it was for her, how they were studying, and in general, what kind of good times. Good times this were, but at the end of the interview, when we actually asked her to just sum up how was the Soviet experience for her, she said that actually just a month after these photographs was taken, she was arrested for a joke about Stalin and imprisoned, and her luck was that that happened at the end of 1952. So in March 1953, after Stalin's death, she was released, and the trial never happened. Otherwise, she would have ended up being sentenced so at least probably 10 years in labor camps, and that just totally transformed everything we talked about for 2.5 hours. That story that she told at the very, very end of the interview. And you could see that, and that's what we try to actually get at when we talk about silences, but also things that are beyond the image, but that those who are owning these images, they have the complexity of that experience when they look at this image, and how can that transpire to others, in what form of communication. So for me, that is perhaps one of the most poignant images.
Yeah, I think that's one that I think if I wanted to inspire folks to start in the middle, that would be the point in the middle, and it's, I think, quite literally in the middle of the book, is chapter 5. I would probably say not specific image, but rather a genre. I find photographs from the Board of Honor fascinating in the enterprises, because they're made for kind of a very ideological and sort of bureaucratic reason, but they're also the most dignified portraits that people often have. They're the ones that are not sort of fully frontal. They're usually 3/4, and people send their best. And they end up in photo albums after they've been hung on the Board of Honor for exemplary labor for some time. And so they bring in this, really bring home this layered resonance of photographs, where they sort of bring some of these public identities back into the album. They oftentimes end up being commemorative images when people pass away, and then they get featured on their tombstones, so that and become points of very intense grief and mourning. And so the way in which they sort of entangle all these different facets of the Soviet project, its public face, its private face, sort of family facing, and the way in which they really illustrate how a photograph can return in many different qualities or different capacities at different points in the life course, I think is really fascinating and interesting to think with.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me the chance to have a discussion with you in front of an audience. I would like to congratulate you again. And thank you very much for spending this evening with us. If you wish to revisit these ideas you've just heard, a colleague of ours at Eidolon Journal will write a short summary of this event. So visit everydayphotography.org, because the summary of this event and a shorter version of this discussion with Olga and Oksana is available right there and will be available. And you've seen it when you enter the room, but the book is available too. So please take a look and buy it if you like it, because I think it will be sold out quite soon, because it's really interesting. So have a nice evening. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you again for the discussion.
And thank you all.
Thank you very much, Róza. Thank you very much to colleagues at Bestsellers for bringing the book here. It was quite a journey, and I would like to invite everyone to a small reception, and we're very happy to continue these conversations over a glass of wine. Thank you very much.